So without further ado, عن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: لا يعطى الناس بدعواهم يدعى رجال أموال قوم ودماؤهم لكن البينة على المدعي واليمين على من أنكر. حديث حسن رواه البيحقي وغيرهما هكذا وبعضه في صحيحين. So this is a hadith that is a very foundational principle in Islamic law. It is narrated by Ibn Abbas, who says that the Prophet ﷺ said, were people to be given what they claim, people would unjustly claim the wealth and lives of others. But the onus of proof is on the plaintiff, or the one who's making the claim, and the oath is on the one who denies the claim. This was narrated by Imam Bayhaqi in this form, and other people also narrated it in this form. And part of this hadith is also mentioned in the two Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. So Ibn Abbas, we've already gone over the Sahabi, but just a brief review. He's one of the major Sahabis who was also related to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was known as basically the master of tafsir of the Quran. He was one of the best Sahabi at exegesis or explanation of the meaning of Quranic verses. And he's the one who narrates this hadith to us. And so this hadith is very beautiful because, like I mentioned, it's one of the foundational principles in Islamic law. It really goes to show, it's like, we'll try to show a little more in today's explanation, but it shows kind of how organized Islam is as a religion and how holistic it is. It's not just a religion that you keep at your home, but it's also a religion that has a way to set up a court system and a way to administer justice in a very practical way. So we'll try to get into just a little bit, try to just show that a little bit today, inshallah. Imam al-Nawawi says, like I mentioned, that this hadith is a great principle in Islamic law. And so, like a kind of minor point that came up is that in the wording it says men, but basically everyone has almost the overwhelming majority of the opinions, and a correct opinion is that it applies to both women and men. And other narrations have mentioned qawm instead of rijal, so saying people instead of men. And so, some people try to mistranslate it as just specific to men, but it applies to all people. Imam al-Tlibi, who is a scholar, he said that the word aqdiya is like any issue that's presented to a qadi. So aqdiya is like the issue that's presented to a qadi. A qadi means a judge. So aqdiya is like a legal case, or a legal case brought to a judge. And so what's interesting here is that it's something that's brought to a judge, not the judge going out to seek issues and flaws in people and try to give commandments and fix issues. It's like something that's brought to a court, which is an important principle also Islamically. Qadi, the word itself comes from qada, which is something that's to mandate. And so an important distinction also is that, we've maybe heard these terms like mufti. Mufti is someone who can give a ruling or an opinion, but they can't enforce it. Whereas a qadi is someone who can not only give the ruling and opinion, but they can also enforce it legally with the force of law. And so that's kind of just some background terminology. So obviously not every issue needs to be elevated to the level of a court, and we've seen in the past hadith, like Imam al-Nawawi has built and established kind of etiquettes and character that can help us avoid conflict to begin with. But now that we're in a situation where there might be a conflict, how do you deal with that conflict situation? And so now we're getting to that in this hadith here. And so what's also interesting is that Islam does not tolerate vigilantes at all, which is very important historically in Islamic history, but then also in the modern day you see a lot of the issues that happen, people giving bad name to Islam, is when they kind of try to implement laws in a vigilante way. So they see they have a subjective opinion and interpretation of how things should be, and they try to do that themselves without a due process, without a court system, without having a balance of evidence. And so, that's a very un-Islamic thing to actually be doing. It goes against all the principles of Islam. So that's a very important thing, I think, to mention. And so obviously there's a court process, and we'll try to explain very briefly kind of part of that process. And so, one thing that the Islamic process tries to do is to take out some of the subjectivity that's involved. A lot of people have emotions or their own experience with something. For example, if you have a contract, two people might interpret that same contract in a different way. But the idea here is the hadith is telling us to bring proof, to bring evidence, to try to make it not just subjective, but also to bring some objective evidence. And so to kind of go over some of, just very briefly, Mufti Kamani mentioned some of the benefits of being a qadi. So being a judge itself is a very honored and very emeritus role historically in Islam. The Prophet ﷺ himself, he was a qadi, that was his role. He was someone who distributed justice amongst people. And the Sahaba were also, most of them ended up being like judges in their times, and many of the Tabi'in. And so like some of the best scholars of our time end up being judges. So it's a very like lofty role. Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, who's also a very famous, prominent Sahabi, he said that to judge for one day is dearer to his heart than to worship for 70 years. And the idea here is that in worship, it's a personal connection between you and Allah, and it's beautiful, and it's not something to like put down. But when you're judging, you're benefiting other people in the community and society, and you're administering justice on a societal scale. And so, scholars have kind of broken this down into 3 different categories. There's people who it's obligatory for them to be a judge because they're the most qualified, and if by not taking the position of a judge, then there's going to be harm. Like someone who's not as qualified will take that position, and they won't be able to do as good of a job. So for that person, they must be a judge. There are people who it's prohibited for them to be in a position of a judge because they're not qualified. They don't know what they're talking about. They have no experience. And there's even a hadith that says that someone who's appointed as a judge for people is essentially slaughtered without a knife. He's already slaughtered without a knife. And so it's like a very dangerous position to put yourself in a position of a judge without qualifications. And then there's a third position of being permitted. It's not like you don't have to do it, you don't have to not do it. And so that's like a situation where you're qualified, but you're not the only person who's qualified. There's already other people. And so in this situation, some people have said that it's actually mustahab, it's better for you to take that position because there's so much reward in trying to administer justice. Other people said it's makruh, you should stay away from it because it puts so much responsibility on your shoulders. And so some other, like I mentioned the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud, who's very supportive of wanting to be a judge, but there's other people, like Ibn Umar, for example, who's the son of Umar ibn Khattab, who refused to be a judge when Uthman tried to appoint him. And another Sahabi mentioned that he would rather be in the grave than be a judge. So it's a very there's a lot of reward to it, but also a lot of responsibility. So it's not something that we take lightly in the religion, this position of administering justice. And so, basically kind of the takeaway of that conversation is that, don't be that guy who's giving opinions without qualifications, without knowing what you're talking about. So if you whether it's like in Islam, you're giving Islamic opinions, or if you're in medicine, giving medical opinions, or you're an engineer giving engineering opinions, stick to your lane basically and giving opinions in that lane. And so what's interesting here is, here's a case study of a man who came to the Prophet ﷺ with a case. And he said that someone had stolen something from him. So the Prophet ﷺ said, bring forth the evidence. And the man said, I have no proof. There's no evidence. I have it. It's my thing. I don't have a receipt. There's nothing that he can use to prove. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, bring evidence or we'll have to take the oath of the man. And so the person said that, I don't have evidence, and so what am I going to do? In that situation, he's just going to oath. He's just going to swear by Allah that he has that thing, he's going to take it from you. And so here, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned a verse actually from Surah Al-Imran, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَشْتَرُونَ بِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ وَإِيمَانِهِمْ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. And so he says indeed, there are people who trade their testimony and the faith in Allah for a trifling gain, for a very insignificant gain. And that verse goes on to mention 4 punishments that Allah mentioned. It's one of honestly the most severe verses in all of the Quran. It says those people who do that, not only will they enter the fire, but then Allah also won't speak to them on the day of judgment, and they also won't be mentioned on the day of judgment, and that they'll have a painful punishment awaiting them. It's one of the most severe punishments possible in the Quran is for someone who gives a false testimony unjustly. And so what's very beautiful here is that in any society with a court system, there is if you have proof, then you can get your justice. There's a way to try to get your justice. Ideally, if you have proof, you should be able to get your justice. But if you don't have proof, then you really can't get justice in a non-Islamic system. What Islam is trying to do here is that in a situation where you're in the right, but you have no proof, there's still an opportunity. The person still has to swear. And if that person's honest, then you'll get your justice. If that person's dishonest, then Allah's guaranteeing you justice, like an ultimate justice in the hereafter. And so even if people get away from the justice in this world, they're not going to get away from it in the hereafter. And that understanding is so important to a legal system. Because if you have just a system in this world, there's always going to be cases that slip through the system. There's always going to be cases where you don't have enough evidence or someone gets something unjustly. But to have a full understanding of that there's going to be ultimate justice is very, very important. Umar ibn Khattab mentions that in the times of the Prophet ﷺ, he would rule with revelation. So there could be no injustice. But then afterwards, they'd have to rule with externalities, what was obvious to people, what was seen by people. And so that's an imperfect system because we have imperfect information, and limited understanding ourselves. So you'll never have a perfect outcome in this world. Allah is the only one with perfect knowledge and justice. And so the idea is that we believe that there will be ultimate justice in that situation. And a beautiful example of this is Ali radiallahu anhuma, when he was a Khalifa, when he was the ruler of the Muslims, one of the most powerful people on the planet. Someone stole his armor. That person, and he wasn't even a Muslim man, that man was a Jewish man. And he stole Ali's armor. And so Ali, instead of forcing it from him, getting the police, grabbing the army, whatever it was, he went to court and he waited in line. He waited in line to get to court. He had a very famous qadi, a very famous judge. His name was Qadi Shurayh, who was a very famous judge under Ali. And so the qadi said, bring your evidence. And so Ali brought a witness, he brought his son. And so the qadi rejected it. He said that there's a conflict of interest here. He's your son, he's going to side on your side. Bring another witness. So Ali brought a slave he had freed. And he said that this is also a conflict of interest because that person has incentive to be on your side. And so Ali was kind of stumped. He had no other witnesses, no other proof. And so the judge actually was in favor of the Jewish man who had stolen the armor and gave the armor to the Jewish man. And so when they left, the man came up to Ali and he says that he was so shocked because not only did Ali not force it from him or kill him or punish him or like imprison him, he went to a court system, accepted the ruling, and for that, like the man said, like this can come from sincerity, and became actually Muslim from that. So that's a very, I think, beautiful example of this system working very well. And so just to get a few more points across here before we end, inshallah, is like what defines a plaintiff or a defendant. Ibn Hajar, another scholar, he mentions that the plaintiff is someone who claims something that's contrary to what's obvious or what's like the default situation. So for example, if Imran stole my shoes, right? The default situation is Imran has the shoes. So by default, it's his shoes. So I need to prove that the current situation, which is he has my shoes, is not true. And so the onus of proof is on me. And so the gold standard for proof, like what is a proof? Gold standard is usually 2 witnesses or more who have no conflict of interest. And other things that have to be, like a witness also, for example, cannot be someone who's a liar or who has been previously convicted. They have to be someone who's like doesn't have like blatant like fisq, like blatant kind of like indecency in public. They must be someone who have like good memory. Some people say they must be also of age. And so those are kind of things that make a witness kind of like hold up in the court of law. And other forms of evidence like logic or like fingerprints or like other kinds of forms of evidence that you can find also count in an Islamic court. And so then what counts as a testimony is like a witness that's in court. So if like someone bears witness that they saw something in the past or in the present, that is what counts as a witness. And so those are kind of like the legal terminology. We'll skip some of that, inshallah. And another important point that comes up is like one of the greatest sources of conflict is contracts. When you have a transaction between people, you borrow money, you start a business, whatever it is, there's always like, that's one of the biggest sources of conflicts. And so the Quran and the Sunnah always tells us to write things down and have witnesses for that transaction being done, because it prevents a lot of these conflicts that come up later on. So kind of just the summary of all this is that Islam has a system of justice. It's a very comprehensive system. And it's very robust. Like it can conform to different cultures, different times, different eras, and still administer a form of justice in those societies. And just like being careful on a personal level, just like very practically, because we're not living in a society where there's an Islamic court system and a whole like Islamic process going on, is that at least within our own lives, to like be very careful with the claims that we make, and then also being very careful with the claims that we accept. And trying to just make sure that our transactions are something that are witnessed and documented, are just some practical takeaways from all of this. Jazakallah khair for your time.
Jazakallah khair.